kick off. I'll start with a little bit of warm-up, and then I'll take the 4 pillars of what my colleague Guy Claxton and I have termed expansive education. I'll try and unpack it a little bit with you, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of what we see as promising practices, and hoping you'll populate it with your own promising practices. And then I'm going to wrap up with a sort of, so if we were going to try and change this, what might the change involve us in doing? Please welcome, if you're just arriving, just any stage, just come on in. As has already been said, there's a free front row, and you're very welcome to join. Just a few words more about my trajectory so you can place me. I'm hoping that's not my phone. I hope I've turned it off. If you haven't turned your phones off, you might like to, or put them to silent. I'm a trained teacher, was an accidental head, or as you would say, principal of a secondary college or school, high school, secondary school. I say accidental as I was explaining to colleagues in Sydney where it was more resonant. The then real head had discovered some rowers who were quite good at rowing, called Steve Redgrave and Matt Pinsent, who triumphed in the Sydney Olympics after a lot of hard work. And so he was a great coaching head, but he was distinguished by his absence rather than his presence. So he left it to us to run the place in days when you could do that. And that was a really exciting opportunity, and I took it with both hands. But at that stage too, we were doing what you're doing now, but not so imaginatively as you are. We were introducing a national curriculum, and I wasn't convinced that I wanted to remain leading a school for the next 30 years within that regime. So I left the safe, pensionable world of teaching, and it was quite a risk in those days, and went and started a not-for-profit called Learning Through Landscapes, all about the experiential learning opportunities on our doorstep, and in lovely school grounds like this all around the place, and particularly thinking about how we redesign schools and the school grounds so that they're fit for purpose, and so that the inner urban areas don't simply replicate the poverty you get from the inner urban flats or tenements or houses where kids come from. From there to, I ran the Campaign for Learning, which brought me, for the second time, into contact with colleagues and educators in Australia. I was the guest of Adult Learning Australia for Adult Learners Week, and had the privilege of going all the way around Australia, really talking about a widening participation message. What could families do, what could schools do, and what could businesses do in terms of improving learning? And then after that, I decided that I should model the thing I kept talking about, which was change. And so I left the relatively safe world of running a not-for-profit and set up a business. And then current final shift of career, I now have the privilege of leading the Centre for Real World Learning at the University of Winchester. Winchester, as you may know from the song, has a cathedral, and if you know England, is about an hour west on the train from London. Just far enough from London to be safe, but close enough to London to be accessible. And that's where I spend about half of my time. The rest of the time, I'm doing wonderful things like the opportunity I have here, and big thanks to my colleague Michelle Anderson, who's in the audience here, who worked for ACER and for LEAP, which she headed, Tenderbridge, the organization within that, and a lot of her work has been to bring together folk from different disciplines. And so thank you, Michelle, for helping to cause this to happen. And thank you to colleagues here at the college, and to Hands-On Learning too, and at the department for making this happen. Hopefully that's enough of a preamble for most people who wanted to come to have arrived. Let's go. So this is the conference that we were involved in last week. There were 4 questions, and those 4 questions are going to reappear now. In rethinking schooling for students to flourish, what capabilities do they need now and in the future? Secondly, how do we transform learning so that we engage and challenge all students, especially by the use of appropriate educational research? Thirdly, how can two-way learning approaches best connect and collaborate with parents, community, and the wider community? And fourthly and lastly, how might this lead us to rethink roles and professional learning within all of those? I'm going to offer you some tentative answers for all of those things. They're works in progress, as is the nature of something as exciting and as challenging as education, and see what you think about them. Everything I say will be predicated, as I said last week, on the belief that actually it's fun, that there is a lifetime of tricky stuff out there, so that one needn't be despondently heading back to school as a parent, possibly, I'm imagining, oh my goodness, I've got to go and find out what my child's doing in School X, but actually because you see it as an act of great excitement that you'll be a learner for life, that schools see themselves with parents and the community as being partners in that, the foundations for a lifetime of learning. I offered this formula, I offer it again, from somebody whose thinking here I particularly admire, called David Gleischer. If we're trying to change anything, and I'd like you to have it in your mind's eye as we go through this conversation together. It's a formula, an algebraic formula, so if you don't like that, look away now. If you can cope with it, here's what it means. D, dissatisfaction, times V, vision, times first steps in the realization of a vision leads to overcoming, or is greater than, resistance to change. And I think what I want to argue, and as you can see, as a psychologist, I'll be arguing this quite forcefully, most of what we do because we've done it for most of our life. We are habituated, we get used to doing it. This is the way I teach this is the way I learn that, this is the way I assess the other. And I think we have to break quite a lot of that because, colleagues, in my view, here's my dissatisfaction. Top-down, accountability-driven reform systems have made very small impact on the lot that is the learner across the world. Here in Australia, I was being shown at that conference some truly shocking statistics about some kids who don't get a good deal, especially at what we would call Key Stage 4, sort of post-14. It's the same in England. And do you know, it's the same in Finland, although you wouldn't sometimes hear that because Finland is always the country we're compared to, where they have something like 20% young people not in employment, education, or training. So while some of the things they're doing in Finland are absolutely on the money, some of them are not. So this is tricky, and my dissatisfaction too is that we live in a world of false opposites, where we're constantly faced with the dilemma of apparently teaching knowledge and skill or teaching something else like capabilities, to use the word that you use here. I think that's a completely false opposite. We want fabulous mathematicians and we want people who can think for themselves in tricky situations which they haven't encountered before. I think we want people who are really cerebral and good with their brains and people who are articulate or manipulate with their hands. And I think that's not an either or, and we'll come on to that as we go through. So my vision is of a world, well, let's sum it up. I think Ron Richardt at Project Zero does a pretty good job here, and so I unapologetically start with a quotation from his work. He's much associated with thinking routines. Some of you I know in the room are interested in that. What, he says, if education were less about acquiring skills and knowledge and more about cultivating the dispositions and habits of mind that students will need for a lifetime of learning, problem solving, and decision making? What if education were less concerned with the end-of-year exam and more concerned with who students become as a result of their schooling? What if we viewed smartness as a goal that students can work toward rather than as something they either have or don't? To which I say, what indeed? And isn't it great that the research lines up precisely in that direction? It's not that we don't know this stuff, it's just that we're not yet always choosing to do it. And it was as a result of that that my colleague and I, Guy Caxton and I, coined the expression expansive education, which I'm about in a few moments to explain to you. But have that at the back of your mind, have your own dissatisfactions, have your own personal vision, have whatever you're doing that you think is indicative of a first step towards what you'd like to be and what you'd like to do and what you'd like to offer. And then I offer that to you as a means of potentially finding the thing you want to be and overcoming the resistance of those in your way. Some of you may know this phenomenon. Have you seen that before? You'll know, of course, that when you look at that, the size of the circle is the same. It just doesn't look that way, does it? I want us to imagine a world in which, from the learner's perspective, they're in the right-hand school. Everything in that school seems to be shuffled around them and their needs. It's learner-centered in the true sense of that phrase. On the left-hand side, all too often, same-size learner, but in comparison, things seem to be out of kilter. The managing of the school, the curriculum of the school, the system that is the school, the assessment structures that inhabit the school, all of these get in the way of putting the learner at the center of this. I want to argue that in the world that we're entering into, we absolutely have to, appropriately. It's not that we're going to not take difficult decisions, not that we're not going to take the responsibility of adults, but that we need to put learners more centrally in all of this. So, forgive me if I just exercise a quick card trick to see how our minds are after a long day of teaching. Can you choose a card, please? Just one of those 5 to the exclusion of the other 4. Everybody got one? Have you all chosen one? Can you give me a sort of nod if you have? Great, okay. So now, if I were to suggest to you that I can confidently predict which card you've all chosen, because you've all chosen the same card, how would that go for you? Now, I know that Mount Eliza is the center of the world's finest minds, so I'm going to guess that you don't really believe that, do you? No. Can I see a kind of a true skeptical? Okay, great. In fact, some of you have gone like, whilst you've been doing have chosen another card, haven't you? Yeah? Why not? Why would you not? On the confident chance that you'll get one over on me. Okay, so just end of Monday, relax, let your shoulders drop, close your eyes, and when you've done that, look up and I'll have removed your card. Or have I? What have I done? Taken a lot. Okay, so quick straw poll here. How many of you thought, blimey, Struth, he's done it? How many of you thought something in between? How many of you never put your hands up in public? Great. Okay. So this is a nice trick of a cognitive scientist and educational philosopher called Andy Clark. And he uses it to demonstrate the phenomenon of inattentional blindness. I'm using it to invite you to think about your own leadership or learning practice and ask yourself the question, what have I stopped noticing? Okay? What am I doing so often that I've kind of stopped noticing? I wouldn't, if somebody came in and gave me feedback that that's the way I introduce topic X, I'd look at them and say, do I really? Well, that's interesting. So just put your noticing muscles on high notice alert, please. And just sparing your blushes, one more little teaser before we get going. How many of you can see a woman at a window? Fantastic. And you're not doing terrifically on this, folks, because there is no woman at the window, is there? Nope. There is a shelf and a raggedy pot plant looking like hair, and a curtain and a wine glass, and then some underwear. Yeah? So are you agreed? On any rational notion, there's no woman at that window. All agreed? Okay, so finest minds in this part of the world. How many of you can still see the woman at the window? Okay. So as we begin our conversation about rethinking schooling and any changes that we may wish to make no mistake that we're pretty set in the way we see the world. We've only got to see a little tricky creativity question like this for about 3 nanoseconds, and yep, that's the way we see it. Even though rationally, we can unpack it and say, that's just a space between objects, can't we? Yeah, which is all it is. Okay, so hold that thought too, because habits and habits of mind are going to be really important to what I'm saying. The 4 pillars of expansive education, as described by Guy Claxton and myself, are these. And they're all, in different ways, spins on the word expansive. The first is this, that it's an expansion, or it's expanding beyond that which is the prescribed core of typical curricula, namely the knowledge and sometimes the skill of what is to be learned. Is that saying that knowledge and skill is a bad thing? No. Knowledge and skill is a wonderful thing. We want passionate, knowledgeable, skilled teachers, don't we? At all levels of our young people's life. Is it also possibly saying, or even possibly saying, that we also want something else? You bet it is. Now, you've had a first pass at this with the 7 capabilities that you're describing at the moment. And I'll come on to that in a second. I think it's an unarguable truism that if we want educated 19-year-olds, we want them to be able to know quite a lot of stuff, probably less than their parents did. Who knows? That's up for discussion. But definitely have certain capabilities or even dispositions to help them thrive in a tricky century. The second spin on the word expand or expanding is the idea that learning and intelligence are themselves expandable. This is not folk kind of mythology. This is good learning science. I'll take you to some of the work that Resnick and Dweck and others are doing, and I think it's being explored in this area of Australia, this state as well. Third is an overt invitation to go beyond the school gate and to think through what that might mean. Not just parents, but a whole range of other actors in that who have other things to contribute to the learning and education of kids. And the fourth is, I think, the most challenging, and it's to rethink the roles of teachers and learners and other adults in the drama, whether they're in philanthropics or not-for-profits or local business or community groups or whatever they are. And it's a fundamental challenge, I believe, to the way we do professional learning, which I think is almost precisely wrong. Most of what we do has very little transfer in the classroom, very little indeed, unless it's got some active application, unless it's probably got some powerful reflection, and sometimes if it's not got some coaching involved, it's unlikely to stick. I'll say more of that as we go through. So what we've done is put together a global network of educators who can gather webwise at www.education or even expansiveeducation.net. It's pretty intuitive. If you Google expansive education, it'll just pop up. And who believe these kinds of things and who see as the logical development of their role the notion that they, as well as being teachers, would also be researchers with a small r. So the notion that they are lifelong learners as well as teachers. This is quite a shift, colleagues. It's happening in lots of areas across the world. Our membership is schools from as north as Aberdeen. I'll end this with a little lovely example of home learning from a tiny primary school there, down to 2 schools in Sydney, and if you wanted to go into South America, to a tiny language school at the very southern tip of South America, and all kinds of schools in between. It's phase neutral, it's type of school neutral, it just says kids are kids, and we believe that we hold these truths as being self-evident, that we want this kind of education, this kind of schooling for our children. It brings together universities from across the world. It brings together businesses from across the world and not-for-profits across the world. In fact, it mirrors exactly the kind of approach that we were taking at the Sydney Rethinking Schooling conference. By all means, have a look. I'm very much hoping that some schools in this state, and I'm pretty confident that some schools in New South Wales will be actively joining up. It would be lovely to have a Made in Australia chapter, or whatever the right noun is, of schools who are really up for teachers as researchers and really passionate about some of these kinds of things. So as we think about how you might create a school in which some of these things happen, we need, I suggest, to go the level down, and that's where I'm going to try and take us. So in articulating practice, we need to think about pedagogy, we need to think about roles, and we need to go down a level. Most of us encounter this geezer at some stage during our professional training. Just wave at me if you encountered Piaget. Not necessarily with a life belt round him. Okay. And we probably, if we're in the early years, we probably encounter him for his theory of child development, the 4 stages, which are, we now know, kind of not quite right, actually, but still a noble attempt. And what I want to introduce him to you for is his general theory of intelligence, which is reputedly, here's what his reputed translation of the French would have been: intelligence is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. In other words, intelligence is non-routine expertise, the thing which is going to be in most short commodity, I think, in the 21st century. So that's right up there as far as I'm concerned, as in, you might want to call it adaptive expertise. And that's helpful, just as you might cite other theorists like David Kolb and his theory of experiential learning, or Vygotsky and his theory of the zone of proximal development. These are useful theories, but they're too big, aren't they? They're too grand. I think for teachers and school leaders to really make a difference and really answer that second question, how do we make the learning relevant and engaging for all young people, we've got to get down to the level of what do we do on a Thursday afternoon. We've got to understand the granularity of the choices, the pedagogical choices that we take. Now, pedagogy, is that a word you use here? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Can you just give me an mm-hmm if it is? Okay. In the States, it would be instructional design. I don't like that. That kind of implies that it's we do the design to them. Pedagogy is a little bit more neutral. Pedagogy, my definition would be the art, science, craft, and sometimes on a difficult Friday afternoon, guile of choosing the right learning method for the right child, yeah? But if I was talking to a skeptical audience that said, yeah, nah, be off with you, fancy word, don't want that, I'd say pedagogy is the moral compass that we have when we make the day in, day out choices with the learners that we teach to try and make sure that the learning gets them all. Is that right? So pedagogy is choices. Now remember that, because that's really important to my argument as we go through it. The kind of choices I think we need to make are, what's our attitude to talent? And how will that lead us to choose different language? How will that lead us to feedback in quite specific ways? Or secondly, in terms of the way we organize our activities, how authentic do we try and make them? It's a difficult one, that, because sometimes if you're dealing with something quite abstract, it's quite difficult to make it authentic because it's tough and abstract and hard. So how do we do that? By the way, there's a general shift to the left, but not a binary either or. So you're going to find moments when it's absolutely great to be on the left and absolutely appropriate to be on the right. And I think I want to offer you the conjunction and quite often. We need to be skilled at this and that. And the decision for a teacher is simply, so knowing my context, knowing my learners, where would I put myself on that continuum? And then what kind of methods would drop out from that decision? Other kinds of things one might be considering are one's use of questioning or statementing. Ellen Langer has done really powerful work here, showing how if we create an environment full of questions, that's an inviting environment. If we create an environment full of smug knowing, all I can really do is think, quick, I better get this down before the end of module test. And it's not a motivating, engaging environment. Even those teachers who talk to me until they're blue in the face about Bloom's taxonomy, when I actually go in and watch them and listen to them, quite often they're only asking questions to which they know the answer, and with very limited waiting time for the child to catch up, especially the children who didn't get it in the first place. The practice theory one is really, really interesting. I think it's the one we know least about. So the question presenting for a teacher is, when do I wrap up the theory in a simple diagram, symbol, framework, formula, picture, image, mind map, and then let them play with it? And when do I say, do you know what? I want them to play with it first, and then we'll deduce the theory. And the answer is, that's bang in the middle, isn't it? Sometimes you need to give the theory first because it would be either unsafe or wasteful not to. Other times you really want a bit of struggle. You really want to get that to get set. But what we do know about learning transfer is that it's really important the first time you encounter a new concept to have the theoretical model that will help you drag it out when you meet it, not in maths, but in science, or not in science, but on the football pitch, or not on the football pitch, but back home over the kitchen table. So we need to have some way of defining that. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're going to sit under this talk tonight. Some of them might be pretty obvious. So, for example, we're so bell-bound, aren't we? How great to be in a school that's making a really fantastic experiment to work out what would happen if you offered extended days for all Year 7 and all Year 8. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Who would not want to make the processes of learning more visible, knowing that the act of doing that, as John Hattie, as various others have made clear, is one of the significant methods in which we can enhance achievement, not just attainment, but achievement. And the ultimate, I guess, choice is the kind of role of the learner in all of this, isn't it? Now, it would be a drastic mistake to assume that either one of those is the only way of being. There's a general move to the left, but sometimes there's nothing more powerful than an expert, passionate demonstration of something. Didactic. If that's the only thing you get, then don't be surprised if children really like being spoon-fed. So when we come to think about the outcomes of education that we're desiring, the methods we choose and the choices that we make along those 10 and other dimensions that you'll have in your mind will really make a difference. There is something quite interesting to me known as a signature pedagogy. I think if you're a mathematician or an engineer or a scientist or an artist or a dancer or an athlete, there tend to be certain ways that kind of go with the grain of your discipline. And that's great too, and I think schools, especially as you think about the capabilities, might like to identify those, because it might be that you have natural champions. So that idea that somehow there are ways in which you can think like an engineer or think like a mathematician might be really helpful. I think we ought to need to get even one level lower. And this is drawn from work we've been doing around about what you would call TAFE or vocational pedagogy. But actually, I think it's as relevant to a general education audience. And increasingly, whenever I've shown this, I've not found people who say, don't be ridiculous. And I rather like the idea that this has come from a world that is perhaps less valued than the more general academic educational background that's largely represented here today. So I haven't got time to go through all those, and they cluster up, as you can see. But each one of them is then a choice point. So when you've made those kind of more macro choices, what am I trying to do here, and maybe in the whole term or the whole course, then you need to drop down a level more, don't you, and say, so, okay, I'm trying to teach this to them. What methods, it's normally a cluster of methods, isn't it, might I use to do that? Here's the second pull of these. Learning on the fly is something we've almost forgotten how to do, isn't it? Because we're so programmed. But I know, and I'm sure you know, and can remember great teachers for whom it was your greatest joy when they suddenly lost the plot, or forgot, or something went wrong, or something extraordinary happened, or the computer blew up if you had computers in those days. And suddenly you were learning in an unintendedly enjoyable way and ready for it. We know there's a lot about the online environment that we're just beginning to catch up with. It's not just about flipping the classroom or yes to the Khan Academy. It's much more complicated than that, isn't it? How we can use the tools and processes. Finally, something that the online environment can offer us, I think, in terms of assessment. This is the open badges movement, really giving appropriate credit. So an e-backpack is like a kind of portfolio, except that it can all be bundled up electronically in a way that could be useful in discussions with an employer, or if you're going to a college or going to university, or just wanting to feel good about your progress. It's a really interesting movement. It's open source software. It's something that you might like to consider. I'd like to just unpack, not for too long, because we've only got an hour, some of the thinking behind the 4 pillars of expansive education. The first of which is that intelligence is composite. That as well as being a great mathematician, there are some other things, let's call them habits of mind or disposition or capabilities, which we need kids to get good at, really good at, and be able to summon up in different environments. And Guy and I have had a good go at this over the last decade together. Here's wonderful work known as Building Learning Power. Anybody come across any of his thinking? Thank you. If you haven't, just Google Building Learning Power. I'll give you the web address at the end. And I've added modestly to this too, especially I believe now the OECD's caught up with that, the notion of responsiveness. You'll see all our words begin with the letter R. Why? Well, obviously, a rather lame pun on the old 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. We weren't very good at mnemonics, were we? I offer these to you as, I mean, you must decide what yours are, but as well as whatever your curriculum is, these are the kind of bigger thing, the things that make your heart beat, that get you out of bed in the morning, that are the kind of people you want your young people to become at the end of their educational journey. Michelle Anderson's LEAP project usefully looked at these and found, when you asked a whole range of stakeholders, that the number 1 desired attribute or disposition was resilience. Guy and I have had a go at this too. We've tried to disentangle those which we broadly might describe as being attributes to do with character, and those which we might broadly describe as attributes to do with pro-learning or epistemic dispositions. And the pro-social group, the ones on the left here, things like being generous, not greedy, tolerant, not bigoted, morally brave, not apathetic, ecological, not rapacious. These are deliberately posed like that. Inquisitive, not passive, resilient, not easily defeated, craftsman-like, not slapdash. Be grateful if somebody can give me a gender-neutral word there. We haven't got that quite right, but the craftsperson-like doesn't quite do it for me. So if you can give me an alternative, I would willingly change it. Practical, not only academic. So I think the moral purpose of education, the desired outcomes of education, the thing that gets us out of bed in the morning, surely, is to produce young people who can do this as well as be confident in all the examinations they have to sit, isn't it? The question is, how do I embed it? So in the lived experience of every child's teaching and learning, how do they get this unmistakably all the time? Lauren Resnick, as she often does, puts this beautifully. If you want a clear, sympathetic, elegant summary, intelligent is the habit of persistently trying to understand things and make them function better. It is, if you like, the sum of one's habits of mind. I think, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as somebody who leads a centre called the Centre for Real World Learning, that's what being smart really is about. Now, one part of being smart is passing school tests and school exams, isn't it? So don't forget that, but that's one part of it for how many years of your life? Quite an important few years of your life, and quite a passport to other things that you will do. So you will notice I'm not arguing for an either or. I want both. I want kids who are really good in both games, the games of exams and the games of tricky stuff that is what they need to do in life. Here's your 7 capabilities, and as I talk to Australian educators, I'm increasingly aware that they're upper level. They're like my 5 or 6 R's. They need to come down a level so that we see what it begins to look like if it's embedded in history, or if it's embedded in maths, or if it's embedded in, and I know this is some of the work that's going on right now. So some of the promising practices in this first pillar I would offer you would be the work of my colleague Guy Claxton, to which I declare interest. I'm very much involved in it, writing, developing thoughts there. And just an example of a school in Sydney called Rudy Hill that I think has got a really interesting take on this. So the Building Learning Power offer here is to say, well, there's a parallel world here, guys, and we can get quite specific in articulating what the kinds of capabilities are, but at a level down. In Building Learning Power, we use the word disposition rather than the word capability. Quick exemplar as to why we do, forgive me if you've heard me say this before. Think of the instrument that you learnt to play as a primary school child in the school classroom, something like a recorder. Ouch. Can you remember the noises you used to make? Okay. So how many of us, a little nod if you can, yeah, at some stage used to make passable noises from a recorder, okay? You had some modicum of skill. So at the end of this long day, when you go home in half an hour's time or so, how many of you will be getting out your recorder and joyfully playing it? Okay, so you had the skill, you possibly even had the capability, but you don't now have the disposition. Disposition means being disposed to use it, choosing to use it. Disposition is the holy grail of learning, isn't it? I can do it in maths, and swipe me sideways, I can also do it in geography. That's what we want, isn't it? When something learned in one environment can be applied and used in another. One of the ways in which we focus on this in Building Learning Power is, well, for a start, to go small. So if we just took perseverance as an example, and then to think about the language and the tool and the framing and the role modeling we might use. Here's something called a stuck poster, which is a simple tool that kids generate. Kids always get stuck. That's what kids do. Adults always get stuck. That's what we do if we're learners, isn't it? We reach an end of our comfort zone and we get stuck. That's not interesting. The question that's interesting is, so what do we do next? Yeah? How do we get unstuck? And that's where it gets interesting. The stuck poster is a process by which a class or a group in a class come up with their own preferred ways of getting stuck, so that the next time they get stuck, the teacher isn't surrounded by a forest of arms saying, help, I'm stuck, but will just say, have a look, have you tried that? Or is it sometimes called in England, 3 before me? Try 3 before me, do you use that? So this notion that we want to encourage a degree of autonomy and creativity. Central to Building Learning Power is the split screen metaphor. So here's how you embed this. Today we are going to do some tricky maths. I want you all to get your stuck posters out, because at the same time, we're really going to work out the strategies we need, the thinking routines, if you like, that are going to help us to do this more effectively. Now, in this family of approaches, like Building Learning and Power, I could put others. I could put Art Costa and Ben Acalek's wonderful Habits of Mind work, the Ron Richard work on thinking routines I've already cited, back in England, the RSA's Opening Minds approach. So this is not a bunch of people in a part of England going, we'll have 1 of those, 5 of those, and 10 of those. These are all well-trialed. Many of these have been around for a decade and a half, and where they've begun to be researched, they're producing huge gains in both of the worlds that I'm talking about. So traditional performance gain in examinations and more confident, powerful learners. What's not to want there? What's not to want? Isn't that part of how we might go about doing this? I really like the way that Chris Causey, the principal of Rooty Hill, is taking another approach here. She's saying, well, maybe there's a sort of hierarchy as we try and get our heads around the capabilities. Maybe the capabilities sit in the kind of middle zone. There are skills, which we can probably already have mapped across the different subjects. Then there are capabilities, which may be clusters of skills. And then there are really making sure that those, as David Perkins from Harvard puts it, there's that sensitivity to occasion, that when the situation demands it, you can say, oh yeah, that's how I'll do this. And you've dragged it from something that you've learned from some other context, and you've got the disposition to be able to apply it. So that by the time you leave school at 19, you've really got a really great backpack of dispositions at your disposal. And the question we were asking at the conference was that one. I think it's a really valid question. I'm very interested to know what your answer to it is. And no school can not have an answer, can you? No teacher can not have an answer. This is not, we're not accountants. We're presumably driven by, we want genuinely, for a social good and moral good, we want to improve outcomes for the young people we have the privilege, or sometimes it's a privilege, sometimes it feels not a privilege, but you know what I mean. In the real world, it's tough sometimes, of really helping them develop. The second thing that we talked about, I just want to highlight two aspects of this, is this notion of learning being learnable and expandable and what that might mean. And I want to you probably can't see this, and so probably it's pretty stupid. I didn't know that you're quite as far away, but so there are a list of myths. I'm going to cut to the chase here because we don't have time. So I'm not even asking whether you think they're true or false. I'm going to argue strongly that in some degree, the idea, let's take number 3, that mind and body are separate and truly intelligent activity is located in the mind, is a kind of myth that if you push the system not too hard, it's still there. The kind of myth that says, you know what, intelligence is relatively fixed. If you push the system, it's there. It's why ability grading is so much favored by many educators. And we've taken some time, Guy and I, to try and lasso these myths and share the science. Now, in some of these, it's breaking news. The notion that intuition might be something that's a really valuable thing to learn at school it's a whole new area. And there are some fabulous schools undertaking work in areas like meditation and mindfulness and a whole number of others that might be interesting to get round. I haven't got time to do that. We've been talking about intelligence is composite. I want to just shine the light very, very briefly on the idea that learning is itself learnable and something practical as well. The 3 things I want to throw at you here are the idea that we have from Carol Dweck that growth mindsets are to be desired, the work that's going on here on hands-on and real-time learning, and the work that happens in the States called expeditionary learning, and one particular fabulous educator from that tradition. So we're in a world, aren't we, colleagues, of Homer Simpsons, a world where we're entitled to think, we're surrounded by the notion that we're sort of full up, we're stuck, we can't take any more, we can't get any better. I am what I am. I've got a kind of fixed bucket of intelligence and, well, get off my back. I'll do my best-ish, all right? Now, what if that is completely wrong? What if the nature-nurture argument is shifting quite interestingly? Now, not completely. I can't change my height, I can't change the color of my eyes unless I wear contacts, etc. Thanks, Mum. Thanks, Dad. But I can do quite a lot about quite a lot of the way my mind habitually and non-habitually functions. And Carol Dweck and Lauren Resnick and Ellen Langer, I think, are, for me, and David Perkins, and to a lesser extent, Howard Gardner, are the people who've really populated this place of the research landscape. And the thing that Carol Dweck has done, which I think is unambiguously helpful, is to say, look, guys, there are 2 kinds of learner. There is the kind of learner who loves to prove stuff, loves the safety of it, loves to demonstrate their cleverness, doesn't necessarily like to kind of show their workings. It's kind of to be seen like this, going kind of, get away, get away, get away, yeah? Can you think of children falling into this category? Probably can, and adults, by the way. You think of colleagues, don't tell me. And then there are those people who love the improving, who see adventure and mistakes as a badge of honor. Not the same mistake all the time, that would be stupid, yeah? But the pushing yourself, the zone of proximal development, that's what all that means, that Vygotskian stuff. And are constantly collaborative because they're always wanting to get help from others because they think they might learn as a consequence. Now, what if I were able to show you demonstrable research found not just by Dweck but by other researchers now, that those people in the right-hand column do better on NAPLAN, on PISA, on standard assessment tasks, and as learners in life than the ones on the left. Okay? That is the case. What would you want as educators? Which kinds of young people would you want to try and cultivate? The ones on the right. So you wouldn't even be saying, well, so your next question would be what? How do I do it? And maybe an appropriate question would be, that's interesting. Are you stuck, doomed to a life of being in the fixed mindset world? Well, luckily you're not, so let's get rid of that question. And the principal way in which you shift kids is the way you give feedback. The way you give feedback is way beyond assessment for learning, good as that is. This is quite specifically whether you're operating on a person praise metric or whether you're taking precise, noticeable, actionable, close to the action kind of feedback. Like, well done, Bill, another A grade. Utterly useless as a piece of praise. Because Bill, on that particular occasion, has been an idle toad and shoved the work in second rate, knowing it was that he'd kind of fooled you. So what's Bill hearing? Well done, Bill, you fooled the system yet again. You're gaming the system well. But well done, Bill, that is an A grade, but it's an A grade because I really noticed the way that was really thoughtful the way you, and it's quite specific. Can you hear that difference? What's that doing to Bill's kind of back of Bill's head? It's saying, wow, you mean this discretionary effort thing really works? Yeah? You mean it's worth it? So Bill's hearing that. Now, there's a whole literature of expertise out there, from Dreyfus and Dreyfus, from Anders Ericsson, all the 10,000 hours stuff, that we know how to do that. But the mindset shift is the first and most important shift to make. So, as Lauren Resnick so often does, here is it expressed as you might need to say or want to say it to a parent who's saying to you, so why are you doing all this growth mindset stuff rather than teaching my kids how to speak properly? Well, that's argument enough, isn't it? It's a pretty decent argument. Back to Piaget, who know what to do when they don't know what to do. So that's really important, and the management world has caught up with it too. So next time you're at the airport, pick up one of these. If you haven't got it, they're all on the same place. They're all showing the different ways in which, in sports science, we've known this for years, different ways in which we can get smarter. The other way, and I think this is particularly relevant, of expanding and expandable intelligence is saying there's a whole bit of what kids do, let's call it practical, that we don't give honor to at the moment. And that's where I think quite a lot of the great work at this particular college is going on. I like particularly the word manipulate, don't you? We talk about articulate kids. I want manipulate kids. I've been working a lot in the Middle East at the moment, and there things are so highly spec'd that I'm presumably quite soon there will be a machine for putting your shoe on. You can't wire a plug, there aren't such things as old cars, so you can't learn about how to fix a car. All the white goods have high-spec computers in them, so there's no longer any real way of mucking about and getting your hands dirty. That seems to me a terrible shame. Once upon a time, way back in the mists of time, at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a fourth R. It was rorting, which means making stuff, yeah? Fashioning stuff. But that became unfashionable when the burgeoning grammar schools in Sydney and Melbourne, and doubtless one close to here, thought, or at least the people who sent their children there thought, I don't want my kids hanging out with the people who are making the wheels and making the ships. I want my kids hanging out with the people who are going to be doctors and philosophers and, well, you know what, and maybe not philosophers. So it got dropped in favor of writing. Sad, I think, because I think that's why we really need hands-on learning. Because for a variety of reasons, a significant amount, I was looking at data recently, and it varies across the world, but somewhere between 15 and 50% report at different ages of the student journey that they are disengaged from learning. I don't know what the figure is here in this part of Australia, and it's probably school by school and year by year, because things change, don't they? Kids are never quite the same. But let's suppose there are really important other ways of engaging people. How good would that be? And so I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and have, I think, since I last came, where there were 15 or so schools, now there are more than 50. That seems to be absolutely wonderful. And two, I'm particularly interested in the initiative taking place here on real-time learning, which does something for me which is more tricky. Because the proof of concept here, there is a proof of concept. It happens in the opening mind schools, in expanded schools, in in America. So there is a proof of concept, but it's tricky to say for part of your time you do these things called subjects, and part of your time you do this other thing called more expanded, more real time. It's been my pleasure to hang out a bit with some of the team from that. And I'd say to you guys, just keep going. This is hard, but it is the job. If we could crack this, and if all schools could let a bit more light in, back to my continua, so we didn't always have to be bell-bound, what an interesting place that would be. Go read Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi on the state of flow. We know that some of the deepest learning takes place when we really get engaged in something and it transcends the bell. But most of us know we never get the chance to transcend the bell because the bell's gone and I've got to send them off to Mr. What's-It. Otherwise, he'll be grumpy if they arrive late. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to be genderist. Or Mrs. Thingy as well. She'll be grumpy if they arrive late. Because we're all up against the clock. Now, Guy and I have done quite a lot of thinking about this, about the kind of habits of mind that go with doing practical things. Here's the formula, here's the kind of approach we've adopted. Again, I'll give you the web address at the end if you're interested in any of that. Another example is the expeditionary movement in the States, and particularly I love the work of Ron Berger. If you've not come across his thinking, an ethic of excellence would be a simple starting point, but a really profound one, where he talks about one thing, how we need to teach all kids to critique each other's work in such an environment that that work in progress and that confidence that they begin to gain stops them handing in shoddy work. And we role model our pride in a job well done, that we overcome that sense that you too often get in schools of, well, I can give it in because it's good enough. It's good enough. It's not good enough in the expeditionary learning world. So my answer to that is, well, we use research from quite specifically learnable intelligence and quite specifically embodied cognition. Embodied cognition researchers have shown that, and Descartes' Error is one of the most famous books by Antonio Damasio. It shows how this idea that we are brain and body and that they're separate is just not true. Simply not true. It's not biologically, neuroscientifically, aesthetically, any way true. So, and here I'm going to run here because we've not got that much time now. We've got about 10 minutes. Now, I'm sorry about that, if that's distressing anybody. Quick check, how many of us are parents in the room? I do hope, none of the little ducklings have dropped down the cracks whilst you've been here. And congratulations or commiserations, depending on how you're feeling. And why am I showing you that? Well, because it's sort of thought-provoking. And it says to me the most important thing that we as schools need to say to our parent bodies, which are, it's hard. There is no manual, it's hard. Empathy, empathy, empathy. And the next thing we need to do is to realize how what we do impacts so negatively on their stress levels. Okay, these are not kids. And the next thing we need to do is do the maths and say, well, hang on, whose watch are they on for much of the time? And if they're on your watch for more of the time they're on our watch, never mind the statistics, but it's roughly 75-25. What are we doing about that? And then, well, hang on, what does the research say? The research says that there are 3 important ways in which parental engagement radically improves what we're doing. So I want everything, yeah? But how do I do it? I'm in a secondary college now, and the last thing these kids want, pubertic kids want, is mum or dad around, yeah? Last thing I want around, so we've got to be cunning. And if you're here from a primary school or an elementary school or early years, it's much easier. Well, it's still difficult, but it's much easier. But we know it really, really counts. Look at the impact size. Look at the effect size. The way in which school and family and other family parenting, other things have an impact. You can see that by the age of 16, it's still there, the parenting bit. It's sort of 15%, 14% to be precise. But look at what it is at age 11. That seems to be such an important cusp of where quite a lot of the work that we're talking about in a year 7 context will be landing. So promising practices here. We'll go and look at the work of the National Network of Partnership Schools that Joyce Epstein runs and all of her wonderful work. And I'm going to give you a few more citations too. Not got time to go through this, but Google Epstein 6 types of parenting. And you will get quite the most thoughtful framework from a school-out perspective. Don't forget, I'm arguing this is 2-way. And then you'll remind yourself that, of course, that's interesting, but actually the research says it's what parents do at home that has most impact on learning outcomes. Well, that's a funny thing. Well, actually, but hang on, something else going on. In terms of the social capital of building involvement of parents and community, then there's a really powerful thing that happens when parents and families become involved in schools. So let's look at it from the parents and families end of things, and we can see there's some really powerful things about, the most powerful is routines and high expectations. And there are other things about role modeling which will not surprise you. Again, I can give you a web address where you could download some research from this at the end if you're interested. Here's a nice example of some work up in Hume City of how a whole city council has got its head round here. And I'm really interested in how communities, not just a school, get their head round what this might mean. In England, surprisingly to us, the Confederation for British Industry has been one of the most powerful advocates for laying the foundations with parents. It's calling for a national campaign. In a recent wonderful publication of theirs where they talk about ambition, they talk about ambition in the way that we reframe the partnership with parents. All of which leads me to that question: how can we, how are we? And in the conference we spent a lot of time surfacing some of the great things that are going on here in Australia. Predominantly, but not exclusively, in New South Wales and Victoria. And that leads me finally to how do we shift the way we do professional learning? How do we shift the roles? You can see the shift implying the parents being more involved, more actively involved. How do we shift the roles so, as we found in the Expansive Education Network, we now have about 2,000 teacher researchers on our books spread across the world who have decided that as well as teaching fabulously, they want to notice better. Do you remember that image I used to begin with? What have I stopped noticing? Action research or practitioner inquiry is, as the Expansive Education Network is beginning to show, a kind of better noticing. Or if you want to call it professional inquiry or leading a learning inquiry. So you're beginning to think what's getting to you, articulate your hunches about what the cause might be. Look at some of the research. It might be as simple as going to talk to other colleagues, or as complex as reading stuff that's really thoughtful about it, and framing your own question, as any inquirer does. And the questions that we encourage teachers to frame are in this sort of format. This is not double-blind, random, controlled investigation. This is the teacher as actor in his or her drama, testing out small tests of change that they believe to be in the interest. It's a bit like what you're doing here with both hands-on learning and real-time learning. You've not gone, I'll have one of those, and 10 of those. You've gone, there seems to be enough evidence to convince me that this would be worth doing. Now let's see what happens. And all the time we're thinking, yeah, we want better mathematicians, but we want more resilient mathematicians. Or we want that, so how might we best do it? What's the intervention? So if we were taking that first of my lines of decision-making, we wanted to get more growth mindsets, then we might be asking questions like this. If I encourage my pupils to develop growth mindsets, will their inclination to persevere improve? If I only give feedback which is specific and actionable, will students be more disposed to practice? Yeah? You can see how the action is contingent on the desired outcome, not the other way around. That seems to me really important to this moral venture that we're all involved in. This is an ordinary school. It looks rather fancy there, but it's actually the building's falling to pieces, but you don't need to know that. In Hampshire, not in a particularly prosperous area of Hampshire. It's called Bay House School. It's led by an absolutely wonderful head, Ian Potter. This is the termly action research journal that the school produces. All members of the staff contribute. They all belong to professional learning communities within that school. It's as ordinary a school in the nicest possible sense as Mount Eliza is. It's about the same size. And that's their choice. Why? Well, because they see that the radical shift that brings, the inquiring mind that brings from all colleagues, shifts the discourse that takes place in the staff room, shifts the conversation that takes place between teachers and parents. The remarkable feature, as John Hattie puts it after this magisterial first of his trilogy of books in the recent 8-year period, is this. We need students who will teach more and teachers who will teach less and become learners of their teaching. In other words, to start to notice what they might do differently and to try it out. In health, this has now been going for probably 2 or 3 decades. It's called the PDSA cycle, where you will try out small tests of change and you will see how that might help you to improve what you're doing. We need that. Here's the New South Wales recent public schools professional development program, which I was privileged to go and speak at last week, hearing how Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of schools had repurposed their professional learning so that they were now in an ongoing cluster of schools inquiring about subjects of real interest to them. Is that how you do it? Is that how you'd like to do it? Is that how you might give it a go at doing if you don't do it now? I'd invite you to come and join us in the broad expansive education movement if you are interested. So my argument is that there are 4 pillars to expansive education, but almost everything comes down to this level below the rhetoric of capabilities, important as that is. And it's about the decisions that we take on a day-in, day-out basis, the methods that we choose as we make these pedagogical choices, as we carve up what we want to offer to our young people. And if you like that idea, then the question is not, should I do this? The question is, surely, which of my habits would I have to change to do this? So let me just end with just a few thoughts about habit change. So not just how might we, about the specific how might we think professional roles, but if we might shift any of this, what might that mean for us as habituated people who tend to think that there's a woman at the window even if there isn't? Well, Michael Fullan has written very elegantly about this over decades now, and I think part of what we need to consider here is the way in which we can have a shared meaning in our schools, in our clusters of schools, about what is involved here. It's not one individual, it's a community. I think the single most important thing we can offer folk is safe exposure to a new way of thinking. And here is a bit of science, actually. It's called the mere exposure effect, or as I'm going to present it to you, it's called a funny piece of wallpaper. How many of you, when you've moved into a house or flat or apartment or whatever for the first time, think, oh, yeah, I like this. By the way, research shows that we largely use our intuition when we buy houses rather than our maths. Or if we do use our maths, we're less happy than if we've used our intuition. But that's by the by. Somewhere you're scurrying around, you think, yeah, that's great. Suddenly you come across something like that, and you think, don't you, that has to go. And you say it very confidently to your partner, and your partner nods very confidently. But about, let's say, a month later, after a busy month's teaching or leading or working or whatever you're doing, parenting, you kind of get to the end of the week and you're having a meal together and a little voice rises up in your ear. You know what it's going to say? You know, that wallpaper, it's kind of beginning to grow on me. Ah! Because you have become victim of the mere exposure effect. Actually, far from the old proverb that familiarity breeds contempt, familiarity actually breeds content. So one of our job, I think, as leaders, and we're all leaders, is to try stuff out. Try stuff out safely. Expose kids and us to things that we genuinely believe may, on balance, do them some good. And the second thing I think we need to do is to scratch each other's backs. So be a zebra. Be a zebra, or if you don't like being a zebra, because that's too smelly and too odd, then be a part of a community of practice. Part of a group, whether it's the family of schools that are exploring hands-on learning, or whether it's the family of schools and others who are part of the LEAP program, or whatever affiliations you want to call down. Be part of a community, because I'm absolutely convinced that that's the way ahead. Now, sadly, I tried to access this on the internet, but the internet is blocking it. But I wanted to end, before I give you some web addresses, with this. This is Sam. This is our northernmost expansive education school, and the head, Jenny, sent me this on Friday. She knew I was down here. She said, "Dear Bill, I hope this will cheer you up. I've been working with the school quite a lot." And they've abolished homework in the traditional sense and only set creative home learning now. And Sam's homework, they've been doing angles in maths. Sam's homework was to discover what angle his large piece of elastic had to be to flip a marshmallow over his house. And in the video, you can see Sam, who has a very broad Aberdeen accent, talking to his mum, who's just a hoot too, as they figure it out together. And I think that kind of learning is surely wonderfully what we're about. Whether you were an academic-y kind of person or a practically kind of person, you'd think, yeah, there's something there that I can relate to. And I wanted to end on that because I think we absolutely not have to get into the land of false opposites. We want kids who are articulate and manipulate. Kids who are brilliant with quadratic equations and kind. kids who know the history of Australia inside out and who are empathic, kids who are absolutely wonderful with technology and appropriately skeptical about knowledge claims on Wikipedia. We need all of this, don't we? Not an either or. If we want this, my argument is that's where we set the moral purpose, the compass, then a whole lot of other things will happen. We'll want to read the research and try it out. We'll want to not just do that like that, but we'll want to be a little bit more thoughtful about it and probably undertake our own inquiry. And if we could see the weight of evidence that says engage parents and families, we'll want that. We'll not want to run at it or jump at it, but we'll want to think carefully how we could have a bit of that appropriately for the context that we find ourselves in. So back to the formula that I started with. Your home learning, colleagues, is to try and articulate what you're dissatisfied with, and then to articulate what your vision is. What do you want? And then to lay out some of the first steps. And if you ever find that articulating a dissatisfaction is an unhelpful process because it sends you into the grumps and sends you down in a downward spiral, then use approaches like appreciative inquiry. Before you do that, as we did at the conference last week, start by thinking about all the things that you're doing well at, all the things that you're really pleased with, and make sure you get those down, and then dream on a bit. And that will inform the vision and take you, I hope, to a different place. If you're interested in expansive education, it's a Creative Commons site as well as a membership site. Have a play. This is Expansive Learning down the road in Geelong. This is my small centre and its rather cumbersome URL. If you just Google Centre for Real World Learning, that might be a shortcut. A lot of the papers I've mentioned are free to download from there. Building Learning Power, I've mentioned, needs no explanation, and betterlearners.com.au is our sister organisation, just recently started out and looking and available to work with anybody who's interested. So thank you very, very much for listening for just slightly longer than an hour. Thank you.